So I understand you're working on a manuscript right now, and I'm hoping you can tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah, I'm sort of heads down working on a book called Sonic Life, and it's basically just a musical memoir. And I wanted to sort of approach it where I really focused on the signifiers, the documents that kind of would lead somebody into wanting to devote themselves to the vocation of being an artist or being a musician, and as opposed to anything else. I really didn't want it to be a bit of an ego stroke book, which I think a lot of memoirs tend to be a bit of me thing. It it has to be a me thing, but I'm basically trying to sort of focus on what the outside influences were that sort of brought me into sort of wanting to start a band in New York City at the time of around 79, 1980. I moved to New York City. I started going in there around late 1976, and I find a place there in 78, and I'm playing music there in 78 and 79 with a band of art students from Rhode Island School of Design who were like the next class after Talking Heads. In fact, the first real job I had in New York was taking over Chris France's shipping clerk job in the basement of a store on 57th Street. And so that was the milieu I was in, and I was always the youngest person at the time. These were all kind of older graduates from art school. And I had just sort of I just came out of high school in 76 and flirted with college for a month, but then ran off to New York because I could. It was very close, and I was extremely attracted to a lot of the signifiers. And really wanted the book to focus on what those documents were that were so significant, not just to myself, but to the culture that sort of came to be, and the underground no wave scene, and the particular punk scene of New York City at the time. That was very sort of interconnected with the art world, of which Sonic Youth sort of came out of. And so I really focus on recordings, literature, the recordings of somebody, like the very first Patti Smith record, Hey Joe, television's Little Johnny Jewel, Richard Hell and the Voidoids' Blank Generation, a 7-inch EP, Patty's writing her book, Seventh Heaven, and really looking at these documents and talking about them, like why did they have so much energy and power in that subculture? I've been really looking for a lot of listings in the Village Voice and the Soho News and the East Village Eye, all of which are incredibly hard to find. Unless you kept all those newspapers, which were weeklies, stacked up in your in your apartment, which nobody did. They were all completely ephemeral and thrown away. And so I've reached out to so many people, like professional, magazine collectors and counterculture archivists. Nobody has these things. I mean, and I go to the Library of Congress, and again. It led me nowhere well, I shouldn't say that about the Library of Congress, because the Library of Congress actually led me to as a very specific library in the USA that had microfilm, at least, of the Village Voice, if it was full on. And so I've been really digging deep into the listings of the Village Voice, which has been really interesting for me, because as a 20-year-old, a 21-year-old in the very early 80s, I was 20 in 1978, so 22, 23. And looking at what was happening in the diaspora of downtown counterculture of like 78, 79, 80, it's pretty incredible. And to know that I was actually in a neighborhood where I did not engage with so much of what became so fascinating to me later on in my life, such as the Poetry Project and the work of the third generation New York School of Poetry, and the experimental music that was happening around the kitchen, the free improvisation music that was happening around like Henry Street School with John Zorn and everybody, the emergence of just like new very new, like hip hop music happening that would happen downtown at the Roxy. So all this was happening at the same time. And I'm just basically, walking around 13th Street, like, wondering if I can convince Hilly Crystal to give me a Tuesday night at CBGB's. And, we're just like, wondering where I'm going to get enough money to buy a milkshake or something. And it's like, and I think that was a very common kind of consciousness for a lot of people my age at that time living within that milieu. But to look back at it in research and to see like all this kind of spurious activity that was happening at the same time, which would turn into different, kind of aspects of the counterculture that became so important to me and the band as we sort of like developed. We kept bringing these things in. I mean, what was happening like in the free jazz world of downtown New York City, like in 78, 79, it was replete. It was like happening every night. And in these 3 or 4 different venues, small venues, it was just like this incredible music by a lot of people who are no longer with us, a lot of people who may have disappeared from the scene even before the 80s was over. It's so time machine juicy in a way for me.
Does literature play an interactive role in the music, in your mind, in your heart?
For me, it was always there's always a resonance with reading published literature. I think a lot of it had to do with, for me, was this really being interested in contemporary poetry, post-war poetry, and figuring out exactly what that was living in New York as time went by, there was this lineage of it, other than the more commonly well-known, echelon of like Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs and Groovy Corso, which everybody knows about, but to realize like what that whole school was with Anne Waldman and Diane DePrima and Jim Brodey, and then you go into Ted Greenwald and all these writers around the milieu of downtown New York City, and then that connection that they would have with the rest of the country, with Cleveland, the whole scene around D.A. Levy, the scene around Los Angeles, the scene around Washington, D.C., with Michael Lowley and like his whole scene that was happening. And that became really fascinating to me. And in the same way that it related a lot to my interest in sort of the community that was around underground music and punk rock and no wave and hardcore and even like hip hop. It was very sort of community oriented, and it really was not defined by any consideration in the mainstream or as far as it being something geared to be popular. It was all about sort of this idea of exchange that was in the community of people interested in the forms, that were happening in this art world. And I remember going to a benefit for the poetry project at CBGB in 79, I believe, and the poetry project had a fire. It was a fire benefit. And all of these poets had pretty much invaded CBGB, and on the same night as like the Dead Boys and Richard Hell and the Voidoids were playing, Ted Berrigan and young Eileen Miles were on stage, reading. And I remember being there and recognizing these people from the streets, from the St. Mark's Place and the Lower East Side, East Village, and knowing that they were slightly older than me, obviously. But I recognized them as, and I always knew that they were people who were involved with something going on that was of interest. But I wasn't quite sure what it was, but they were all part of like the poetry project. I kind of moved to New York to actually wanted to be a writer, and to actually go into St. Mark's Poetry Project and see what that was. But I never even entered the gates of it because all the energy was over at CBGB in Max's Kansas City. And the people like Patti Smith and Tom Verlaine and Richard Hell, they were writers, they were poets who were using this music as their forum for their writing. And that was good enough. That was more than enough, you know. The fact that all these people from the Poetry Project were already at CBGB that night, it was really interesting for me, you know, being 19 or 20 years old and seeing like Ted Berrigan on stage reading with his beard and his cigarette and his glasses. I had seen him all the time on the corner of St. Mark's Place and Second Avenue in front of Gem's Spa with acolytes around him. Well, he was just talking. And I just thought he was a cult leader. I was like, because at that time, you know, in the late 70s, there was a holdover of sort of weird hippie cult leaders that you would see on the street with like minions around them. And they've all disappeared. I don't know where these people went, but they still existed from the late 60s and the early 70s. Like these little collectives that would move around the streets, and there would be some kind of ringleader. That's what I thought Ted Berrigan was. You know, he was like the foremost poet of like the third generation school of New York poetry. But there he was on stage, and I was like, oh, it's that guy. And it was always that person. And there's Eileen Miles, and then Richard Hell played, and he called Ted Berrigan out, and he recited a Ted Berrigan poem before he went into his set. And so that whole connection was really, really wonderful to see. In a way, literature was always very significant to the music. I took that as a matter of course early on, and there was a certain respect towards that. It was not something that was uncool. It was something that was very cool, you know, to actually sort of reference literature. So the more pretentious, the better. I mean, you would like, you know, you would find out about Jean Genet, and read these Jean Genet books and be like, oh yeah, I'm going to write about like the criminal aesthetic, you know, in my punk song.